I'm 63 years old now, and for 38 years, I've been the keeper of a secret that has slowly consumed every quiet moment of my life. My name is Dr. Elena Hartfield, and I'm a child psychologist specializing in trauma cases. But before that, before the degrees and the publications and the carefully constructed professional distance I maintain with my patients, I was just a scared park ranger trying to make sense of something that should never have happened, trying to understand what a 7-year-old girl told me about her missing twin sister and the thing that took her into the woods. This is that story, and I'm telling it now because the silence has become heavier than the truth. It was June 14th, 1986. Mount Rainier National Park in Washington State was experiencing one of its most beautiful summers in recent memory. The wildflowers were in full bloom, painting the alpine meadows in sheets of purple lupine and Indian paintbrush. The snowmelt had turned every creek into a rushing torrent of crystalline water. Families were flooding into the park by the hundreds, eager to escape the heat of Seattle and Portland, to breathe air that smelled of Douglas fir and mountain stone. I was 25 years old that summer, fresh out of my forestry program at the University of Washington, and I'd landed my dream job as a junior ranger at the Paradise Visitor Center. I was assigned to the family education programs, leading nature walks for kids, teaching them about the ecosystem, helping parents understand the importance of leave no trace principles. It was everything I'd hoped for, a chance to share my love of the wilderness with the next generation, to spend my days in one of the most stunning places on Earth. The Whitmore family arrived at Paradise on the afternoon of June 13th. I remember them distinctly because they stood out even among the crowds of tourists. Richard and Patricia Whitmore, both in their mid-30s, with their twin daughters Cassidy and Sienna. The girls were 7 years old, identical in every physical way, but completely different in temperament. Cassidy was outgoing, constantly asking questions, touching everything, her voice carrying across the visitor center as she demanded to know about every animal, every plant, every geological formation. Sienna was quieter, more observant, standing close to her mother, watching the world with those enormous hazel eyes that seemed to take in everything and reveal nothing. I was manning the information desk when they approached. Richard Whitmore had that nervous energy of a man trying to orchestrate a perfect family vacation. He wanted to know about the best day hikes for children, about wildlife safety, about whether the trails to Reflection Lakes would be too challenging for 7-year-olds. I walked them through the options, pulled out maps, marked the routes I thought would work best for their family. Patricia Whitmore seemed distracted, I noticed. She kept glancing out the windows toward the peaks, and there was a tightness around her mouth that suggested someone carrying worry they couldn't quite name. When I asked if they had any specific concerns, she hesitated before saying she'd heard stories about the park, about people getting lost, about things in the woods. Her husband laughed it off, said she'd been reading too many hiking horror stories online. But I saw the way her hand tightened on Sienna's shoulder. I gave them my standard safety briefing. Stay on marked trails, carry extra water in layers, keep the children close, make noise while hiking to avoid surprising bears, know what to do if they encountered wildlife. The girls listened with varying degrees of attention. Cassidy bounced on her toes, already planning which rocks she'd climb and which streams she'd jump across. Sienna just watched me with those serious eyes, and when I asked if she had any questions, she said something that I dismissed at the time but would replay in my mind 1,000 times afterward. She asked, very quietly, if the forest was safe at night, if the trees protected people, or if they hid bad things. I smiled and told her that the forest was beautiful and safe as long as you respected it and followed the rules. I told her the trees were ancient and wise, and that nothing bad would happen if she stayed close to her parents. I was so confident, so sure of my knowledge and my training and my understanding of this place I loved. I had no idea how wrong I was, how much I didn't know about what lived in the spaces between the trees. The Whitmores set up their camp at the Cougar Rock campground that evening, Site 47. It was a good spot, reasonably close to the bathrooms and water, nestled among old-growth hemlocks that provided afternoon shade. I know this because I reviewed every detail of their trip afterward, read every statement, studied every photograph they'd taken. I needed to understand what happened, needed to piece together the moments that led to the impossible. They had dinner around their camp stove that night, pasta with red sauce from a jar. Richard noted in his journal, which we found later, that the girls were excited but tired from the drive. They zipped them into their small tent around 8:30, just as the long summer twilight was finally fading into darkness. He and Patricia stayed up for another hour, talking quietly by their Coleman lantern, watching the stars emerge above the mountain peaks. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. At 2:17 in the morning, Patricia Whitmore woke to the sound of her daughter's tent zipper opening. She told investigators later that she assumed one of them needed to use the bathroom, so she called out softly, asking if they needed help. There was no answer. She sat up in her sleeping bag, fumbling for her flashlight, and that's when she heard it. Footsteps, heavy footsteps, moving away from the tent. Not the light patter of 7-year-old feet, but something heavier, something that made the forest floor crunch and compress in a way that sent every alarm in her body screaming. She shook Richard awake, and they both scrambled out of their tent, flashlights swinging wildly through the darkness. The girls' tent was open, empty. The sleeping bags were rumpled, but both children were gone. Patricia started screaming their names, her voice echoing through the campground, waking other campers who emerged bleary and confused from their sights. Richard ran toward the tree line, shouting for his daughters, his flashlight beam bouncing crazily through the undergrowth. And then they heard it, a sound that Patricia Whitmore would describe in her statement as the most terrible thing she'd ever heard in her life. A child screaming, not the startled cry of a kid who'd had a nightmare or stubbed her toe, but a scream of pure terror that went on and on, rising in pitch until it was cut off with a suddenness that was somehow worse than the screaming itself. The campground erupted into chaos. Park rangers were called, emergency protocols activated. I got the phone call at 2:43 in the morning, was told to report to Cougar Rock immediately that we had missing children, possible abduction. I threw on my uniform and drove through the darkness, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, my mind trying to prepare for whatever I was about to face. When I arrived at the campground, it was lit up like a movie set. Every ranger in the area had responded, flashlights and headlamps creating a constellation of lights moving through the trees. Search dogs were being organized, their handlers already getting scent items from the Whitmores' vehicle. Patricia was sobbing, being comforted by a ranger I didn't recognize. Richard was wild-eyed, arguing with the incident commander, insisting we needed more searchers, needed to move faster, needed to find his girls now. I was assigned to the initial search grid, given a sector of forest to sweep with 3 other rangers. We moved through the darkness, calling the girls' names, listening for any response, looking for any sign. The forest at night is a different world, full of sounds that daylight renders harmless, but that take on sinister qualities in the dark. Every snapped branch sounds like a footstep. Every whisper of wind through the trees sounds like a voice. We searched for hours, our voices growing hoarse, our hope beginning to falter. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky above the mountains in shades of pink and gold that felt obscene in their beauty. How could the world be so lovely when two 7-year-old girls were missing? We'd searched through the night and found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. It was as if Cassidy and Sienna Whitmore had simply vanished into the forest air. At 7:32 that morning, one of the search dogs started barking frantically about a quarter-mile from the campground. We all converged on the location, hope and dread warring in our chests. The dog was focused on a small clearing, circling and whining in a way its handler said indicated extreme stress. And then we saw her. Sienna Whitmore was sitting in the middle of the clearing, completely still, her back against a moss-covered log. She was in her pajamas, the pink cotton ones with the cartoon bears that her mother had packed. Her feet were bare and dirty. Her hair was tangled with leaves and pine needles. But she appeared physically unharmed. No visible injuries, no blood, just a small child sitting perfectly still in the forest, staring at nothing. I was the first one to reach her. I knelt down slowly, speaking in the gentlest voice I could manage, telling her my name, telling her she was safe, that her parents were looking for her. She didn't respond, didn't even seem to register my presence. Her eyes were fixed on a point somewhere past my shoulder, focused on something I couldn't see. I reached out carefully and touched her shoulder, and that's when she finally looked at me. The expression on her face wasn't relief or fear or even confusion. It was blank, completely empty, like looking into the eyes of a doll. I'd never seen a child look like that before, and it sent a cold spike of fear through my chest. I scooped her up, she was so light, and carried her back toward the campground where her parents were waiting. Patricia Whitmore's scream when she saw Sienna was equal parts relief and anguish. One daughter found, but where was the other? She grabbed Sienna from my arms, sobbing, checking her over frantically for injuries while asking over and over where Cassidy was, what had happened, where was her sister. Sienna didn't answer. She just let herself be held, her body limp and unresponsive, her eyes still focused on something none of us could see. The paramedics checked her over. No injuries, normal vital signs, mild dehydration, some scratches on her feet from walking barefoot through the forest, but nothing serious. Physically, she was fine. But something was deeply, terribly wrong. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't make eye contact with anyone except, occasionally, her mother. And when they tried to take her to the ambulance to transport her to the hospital for a full evaluation, she started screaming, not words, just this high, thin sound of absolute terror that made everyone in earshot stop what they were doing. The only way to calm her down was to let her mother hold her, and even then, she kept her eyes fixed on the tree line, watching the forest with an intensity that was unnerving. The incident commander made the decision to allow Patricia to stay with Sienna in one of the ranger vehicles while the search for Cassidy continued. Richard joined the search teams, unable to sit still, needing to do something, anything. We searched for 3 days. Every ranger in the park, plus volunteers from the surrounding communities, plus FBI agents who'd been called in because this was now a possible abduction case. We covered hundreds of acres, used helicopters with thermal imaging, brought in additional K9 units. We found nothing, not a shoe, not a hair tie, not a single shred of evidence that Cassidy Whitmore had ever been in those woods. The theories multiplied as the search went on. Animal attack, though there was no blood or tissue. Abduction by a stranger, though no vehicles had been seen in the area, and the logistics of carrying a 7-year-old through rough terrain seemed unlikely. Accidental death with the body somehow hidden or carried off by animals, though again the complete lack of evidence made this implausible. Each theory had fatal flaws, and as the days wore on with no sign of Cassidy, the grim reality began to settle over everyone involved. We were no longer conducting a rescue operation. We were looking for a body. On the 4th day, I was asked to sit with Sienna. The The department had brought in a child psychologist from Seattle, a specialist in trauma cases. But Sienna refused to speak to him or to anyone else. She would only tolerate her mother's presence, and for some reason none of us understood, mine. Patricia Whitmore was exhausted, barely sleeping, her face hollow with grief and terror. She begged me to try, to see if Sienna would tell me anything at all about what had happened that night. I sat with Sienna in a quiet office at the Paradise Visitor Center, the same building where I'd given her family the safety briefing just 4 days earlier, the same place where I'd confidently told them the forest was safe. She was sitting in a chair that was too big for her, her legs dangling, not quite reaching the floor. She had a stuffed rabbit clutched in her arms, something her mother had given her. Her eyes were still fixed on the window, watching the trees beyond the parking lot. I didn't try to make her talk at first. I just sat nearby, pulled out some paper and crayons, and started drawing. Nothing specific, just shapes and colors. After about 20 minutes, Sienna reached out and took a purple crayon. She didn't look at me, but she started to draw. What she drew made my blood run cold. It was crude, the way a 7-year-old's drawing would be, but the subject matter was unmistakable. She drew 2 stick figures, clearly meant to be children. She drew them inside a triangle that I recognized as a tent. Then, next to the tent, she drew a large figure, much larger than the children. It had a rough, shaggy outline that she'd colored in with dark brown and black, going over and over the crayon marks until the paper started to tear. I watched her draw, my heart pounding. When she was finished with the large figure, she drew what looked like a hand reaching towards the tent. The hand had long fingers, longer than they should be. Then she drew one of the stick figure children outside the tent, next to the large figure. She stopped drawing and looked at me for the first time since I'd carried her out of the woods. Her eyes were huge and solemn and filled with something that looked like guilt. She said very quietly, "It took Cassidy." Those were the first words she'd spoken since we'd found her. I tried to keep my voice calm, tried not to show the terror that was crawling up my spine. I asked her what had taken Cassidy. She looked back at her drawing. "The big one," she whispered, "the one that smells like dirt and old things." I asked her to tell me more, to help me understand. She was quiet for a long time, her small fingers gripping the purple crayon so hard her knuckles were white. Then she started to talk, and what she told me in that quiet office, in halting sentences broken by long silences, was the testimony that would haunt me for the next 38 years. Sienna said that she and Cassidy had been asleep in their tent when they heard something outside, a shuffling sound, like someone walking but trying to be quiet. Cassidy had wanted to see what it was. She'd always been the brave one, the one who rushed toward things instead of away from them. She'd unzipped the tent before Sienna could stop her. There was something standing outside their tent, something huge. Sienna described it as being taller than their dad, covered in dark hair, with eyes that reflected the moonlight like an animal's eyes. It had a smell. She kept coming back to the smell, like wet earth and rotting leaves and something else she couldn't name, something old. The thing had looked at both of them. Sienna demonstrated by tilting her head, the way you might study something curious or confusing. Then it had reached out one massive hand and touched Cassidy's shoulder. Not grabbing, not violent, just touching. Cassidy had screamed. That was the scream her parents had heard. And when Cassidy screamed, the thing had picked her up so easily, like Cassidy weighed nothing at all. Sienna said she'd tried to follow them. She'd climbed out of the tent and run after the thing as it walked into the forest carrying her sister. She'd screamed for her parents, for help, for Cassidy, but the thing moved so fast, faster than anything that big should be able to move. She'd followed as far as she could, crying, tripping over roots in the darkness, but it had disappeared into the trees. She'd wandered through the forest all night, lost and alone, calling for Cassidy. As the skies started to lighten, she'd found the clearing and sat down to wait, hoping Cassidy would find her, hoping someone would come, and eventually we had. I asked her as gently as I could if she could describe what the thing looked like. She picked up a brown crayon and drew over the large figure again, adding details this time. She drew what looked like a broad face, a heavy brow. She drew arms that hung down past where the knees would be. She drew feet that were huge and shaped differently than human feet. Then she looked at me and said, "Like the pictures in Daddy's book." The ones about the monster in the woods. Richard Whitmore, it turned out, was an amateur cryptozoologist. He collected books about Bigfoot, had been fascinated by the legends since he was a child. Patricia mentioned this later, almost apologetically, when I asked if Sienna could have been influenced by stories she'd heard. But Patricia was firm that they'd never discussed such things with the girls, that Richard kept his hobby to himself, that there was no way Sienna would have known about those stories. But children hear things, they see things, they absorb information in ways adults don't always track. And under extreme stress, under the trauma of losing her sister in the woods, could Sienna's mind have conjured up something from her father's books to explain the unexplainable? Could her 7-year-old brain have created a monster to make sense of a tragedy? That's what everyone decided. The psychologist from Seattle, after examining Sienna's testimony and drawings, concluded that she was experiencing a trauma response, that she'd witnessed something terrible, possibly an actual abduction by a person, and her mind had transformed the memory into something fantastical to protect her from the full horror. The FBI agents investigating the case were sympathetic but firm in their belief that we were looking for a human perpetrator, not a creature from folklore. The search for Cassidy Whitmore continued for another week, then scaled down to periodic sweeps over the following months. No trace of her was ever found. No body, no clothing, no evidence of what had happened beyond Sienna's testimony and the mysterious footprints that several searchers claimed to have seen in the soft earth near the campground. Footprints that were too large to be human, with a stride length that suggested something much taller than any person. Footprints that disappeared into rocky terrain before we could make proper casts. I photographed those prints before they were lost, measured them with shaking hands. The impressions were deep, suggesting something weighing at least 600 pounds. The toes were articulated, clearly visible, arranged in a pattern that was almost human but not quite. The arch was different, flatter, adapted for different terrain. And the stride, God, the stride was what haunted me most. 6 feet between prints. Whatever made those tracks could cover ground faster than any human runner, could move through that forest with a speed and efficiency that explained how it had vanished so completely with a 7-year-old child. I submitted my photographs and measurements to the incident report. They were filed away, labeled as inconclusive. The official documentation noted possible bear activity in the area, despite the fact that no bear expert who examined those prints thought they came from a bear. It was easier to write it off as unclear evidence than to acknowledge what the prints actually suggested. During those weeks of searching, I barely slept. I'd lie in my small ranger cabin at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of my interaction with the Whitmore family, every reassurance I'd given them. Every confident statement about forest safety. I'd told them the wilderness was predictable if you understood it, that following protocols would keep them secure. I'd been so certain of my expertise, so proud of my knowledge of these mountains. But that certainty had been built on incomplete information. I'd learned about bears and cougars and hypothermia and getting lost. I'd studied weather patterns and trail conditions and how to read topographic maps. Nobody had taught me what to do when something that wasn't supposed to exist took a child in the night. Nobody had protocols for that. I started having nightmares. In them, I'd be back at the information desk, and the Whitmore family would approach. But this time, when Richard asked about the trails, I'd try to warn them. I'd open my mouth to tell them about the things in the forest, the creatures that watched from the shadows, the impossibilities that lived in the spaces between the trees, but no sound would come out. I'd stand there mute while they gathered their maps and headed toward the campground, and I'd watch them go, knowing what was coming but unable to prevent it. Other rangers noticed I wasn't coping well. My supervisor, a woman named Carol Henderson, who'd worked in the park for 20 years, pulled me aside after a particularly rough briefing where I'd barely been able to speak to a family asking about hiking with young children. She took me to her office, closed the door, and asked me directly if I was okay, if I needed to take time off, if the Whitmore case was affecting my ability to do my job. I told her I was fine. Told her I just needed a few more days to process, but we both knew I was lying. The truth was that every family I saw, with children around Cassidy and Sienna's age, made my chest tight. Every question about trail safety made me want to scream that nowhere was safe, that protocols and preparation meant nothing against things we couldn't predict or prevent. Carol was kind about it. She reassigned me to office duties for the rest of that summer, kept me away from direct family interactions. I filed reports, answered phones, organized supply inventories, anything that didn't require me to look parents in the eye and promise them their children would be safe in my forest. The Whitmores left Mount Rainier on June 23, 1986. Patricia was a shell of the woman who'd arrived 10 days earlier, her eyes hollow, her movements mechanical. Richard looked like he'd aged 20 years. He carried Sienna to their car, and she buried her face in his shoulder, refusing to look back at the mountains, at the trees, at the forest that had taken her sister. I stood in the parking lot and watched them drive away, and I felt a failure so complete it was almost physical. I'd told them the forest was safe. I'd promised nothing bad would happen. And a 7-year-old girl had vanished into the woods, leaving behind a twin sister whose testimony suggested something that couldn't be real but couldn't be entirely dismissed either. I quit my job as a park ranger 3 months later. I couldn't do it anymore, couldn't stand in the visitor center and tell families that the trails were safe, that they should enjoy the beauty of nature, that nothing would harm them if they followed the rules. Because I knew now that the rules didn't cover everything, that there were things in the wild places that we didn't understand, couldn't predict, and couldn't protect against. I went back to school, got a degree in psychology, specialized in childhood trauma. I told myself it was because I wanted to help children like Sienna to understand how young minds processed the unprocessable. But really, I was trying to answer the question that had haunted me since that June morning when I'd carried a silent 7-year-old out of the forest. What had really happened to Cassidy Whitmore? Over the years, I tracked Sienna's life from a distance, through newspaper articles, through careful inquiries with mutual contacts, through the occasional update from former ranger colleagues who'd stayed in touch with the family. She grew up damaged but functional, went to therapy for years, struggled with nightmares and anxiety, but eventually graduated high school, went to college, tried to build a normal life. But she never changed her story, never recanted, never admitted it was a dream or a false memory or a trauma-induced hallucination. In every interview, in every therapy session where her testimony was challenged, she held firm. Something had taken her sister, something large and dark and ancient that had emerged from the forest and selected Cassidy for reasons Sienna couldn't understand. I started researching, quietly, in my spare time, using the academic resources available to me as a professor. I looked into Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest, particularly around Mount Rainier. The reports went back over a century. Native American tribes had stories about them, called them different names: Sasquatch, Saxony, mountain devils, creatures that lived in the deepest forests, that avoided humans, that were rarely seen but often sensed. Most of the sightings could be dismissed. Misidentified bears, hoaxes, the power of suggestion. But some of them, the ones from credible witnesses, the ones that included details that matched across decades and geography, the ones that came from people who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by reporting what they'd seen, those were harder to explain away. And then there were the disappearances. I started compiling data, looking for patterns. Missing persons cases in remote wilderness areas, particularly those involving children. The numbers were disturbing. Every year, dozens of people vanished in national parks and forests across the country. Most were eventually found, alive or deceased, their disappearances explained by accidents, exposure, animal attacks, or foul play. But a subset, a small but persistent subset, remained complete mysteries. No bodies found, no evidence, no explanation. Some of these cases had witnesses who reported seeing something unusual: a large figure in the trees, massive footprints near the last known location, strange sounds in the night. But these details were usually buried in reports, dismissed as unreliable, attributed to stress or fear or the desire to find meaning in tragedy. I created a database, mapped the cases, looked for patterns, and I found them. Clusters of disappearances in specific areas, temporal patterns that suggested seasonal activity, victim profiles that skewed toward young children and solitary hikers. The data was compelling enough that I almost published it, almost submitted a paper to a journal on unexplained disappearances in wilderness areas. But I couldn't, because I knew what would happen. My career would be destroyed, my credibility shattered. I'd become that professor, the one who believed in monsters, who'd let a tragic case warp their judgment. So I kept my research private, maintained my professional reputation, and carried the weight of what I suspected alone. Until last year, when Sienna Whitmore contacted me. She was 45 years old now, married, a mother of 2. She'd built what appeared to be a successful life despite the trauma of her childhood. But she told me in her email that she needed to talk to me, that she needed to tell me something she'd kept secret for 37 years, something she'd been too afraid to say when she was 7, too traumatized to articulate when she was older, too aware of how crazy it would sound to ever speak aloud. We met at a coffee shop in Seattle, neutral territory, somewhere public enough that she'd feel safe, but private enough that we could talk. I recognized her immediately. She had her mother's eyes, her father's serious expression. But there was something else there too, something haunted that I recognized from my years of working with trauma survivors. She thanked me for meeting her, for believing her when she was 7, or at least for not dismissing her outright. I told her I'd never forgotten her or her sister, that Cassidy's disappearance had shaped the entire trajectory of my life. She nodded like she'd expected that, like she'd known the weight of that night hadn't rested on her alone. Then she told me what she'd come to say, and what she revealed wasn't just about what had happened that night in 1986. It was about what had happened afterward in the years since, in ways I'd never imagined. It was about why she'd finally decided to break her silence after nearly 4 decades. It was about the dreams. Sienna ordered a coffee she didn't drink. I watched her hands tremble slightly as she wrapped them around the cup, seeking warmth even though it was a mild September afternoon. She stared into the dark liquid for a long moment before she started speaking, and when she did, her voice was so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her over the ambient noise of the coffee shop. The dreams started when she was 8 years old, about a year after Cassidy disappeared. At first, they were simple: more memory than dream. She'd be back in the tent with her sister, hearing the shuffling outside, watching Cassidy unzip the entrance. The creature would be standing there, massive and dark against the night sky, but in these early dreams, the sequence would repeat. She'd watch it happen over and over, unable to change anything, unable to save Cassidy. Her parents took her to therapists, child psychologists who specialized in trauma and grief. They talked about processing, about her mind trying to make sense of loss, about the natural way children's brains work through terrible events during sleep. They gave her techniques for managing nightmares, prescribed medications when the dreams became severe enough to interfere with her sleep. And for a while, the interventions helped. The dreams became less frequent, less intense, but they never stopped entirely. And as Sienna got older, the dreams began to change in ways that disturbed her more than the original nightmares ever had, because the dreams stopped being about what happened and started being about what was happening. Present tense, ongoing. When she was 12, she dreamed about Cassidy standing in a cave. Not a memory, not something from before the disappearance, but Cassidy as she would be at 12 years old. Older, taller, her hair longer. She was wearing clothes made from animal skins, roughly sewn but functional, and she wasn't alone. The creature was there, sitting near the mouth of the cave, and Cassidy was bringing it food, berries in a woven basket. She set the basket down and the creature made a sound, low and rumbling, that seemed almost like gratitude. Sienna woke from that dream sobbing, telling her mother that Cassidy was alive, that she was living in a cave with the thing that took her. Patricia Whitmore held her daughter and tried to explain that dreams weren't real, that grief could create powerful illusions, that Cassidy was gone and these dreams were just Sienna's mind refusing to accept that loss. The therapists agreed. They talked about wish fulfillment, about the brain's resistance to finality, about how trauma survivors often created alternative narratives where the worst hadn't actually happened. But the dreams continued, and they were so specific, so detailed, so consistent that Sienna began keeping a journal, documenting everything she saw. She showed me that journal, pages and pages of descriptions, written in teenage handwriting that became more refined and controlled as the years passed. She'd drawn pictures too, sketches of the cave, of Cassidy, of the creature, of a life that couldn't possibly exist, but that visited Sienna night after night. In the dreams, Cassidy grew up. Sienna watched her twin age in parallel with her own aging, saw her transform from a 7-year-old into a teenager, into a young woman. But while Sienna was attending high school in suburban Seattle, learning algebra and going to dances and worrying about college applications, Dream Cassidy was learning different things: how to identify edible plants, how to track animals through the forest, how to communicate with the creature through sounds and gestures. Because in Sienna's dreams, the creature wasn't a monster. It was a caretaker, a guardian, something that had taken Cassidy not to harm her but to protect her, though from what Sienna could never understand. The creature taught Dream Cassidy how to survive in the wilderness, showed her which berries were safe and which were poison, demonstrated how to fish in mountain streams using nothing but patience and quick hands. And Cassidy, in these dreams, seemed content, not happy exactly, but accepted, adapted. I interrupted Sienna at this point, asked her the question I had to ask. Did she think these dreams were real? Did she believe she was somehow seeing her actual sister, alive somewhere in the mountains, living with a Bigfoot? She looked at me with those serious hazel eyes, so much like the 7-year-old I'd carried out of the forest decades earlier, and said she didn't know. She wanted to believe they were just dreams, just her mind's way of coping with unresolved grief. But the details were too specific, too consistent. Things she had no way of knowing appeared in her dreams, and later turned out to be accurate. She gave me an example. When she was 16, she dreamed about a specific location, a waterfall cascading over black volcanic rock into a deep pool surrounded by old-growth hemlocks. In the dream, Cassidy was teaching a younger creature, a child of the species, how to swim in that pool. The landscape was so vivid that Sienna had drawn it, capturing every detail she could remember. 2 years later, when she was 18 and trying to reclaim some sense of control over her life, she'd gone hiking in Mount Rainier with friends. They'd gone off trail, exploring areas not marked on the standard maps. And Sienna had found it. The exact waterfall from her dream. The black volcanic rock. The deep pool, the ring of hemlocks. Everything matched her drawing with an accuracy that terrified her. She'd stood there, her friends calling from behind her, asking what was wrong, and she'd searched the area frantically for any other sign, any evidence that Cassidy had been there. She found nothing. No footprints, no camping debris, no indication anyone had visited that remote location in years. But the waterfall existed. The place from her dreams was real. Over the years, Sienna had collected more than a dozen such correlations. Places she'd dreamed about that she later found in the real world. Details about the forest, about animal behavior, about seasonal patterns that she had no way of knowing, but that turned out to be accurate. She'd even dreamed about a landslide in a specific location 3 days before it actually happened. Had called the Park Service to warn them, though they dismissed her call as a prank until the slide occurred exactly where and when she'd described. I asked her if she'd ever considered that maybe she had visited these places before as a child and had forgotten. That her dreams were pulling from real memories rather than showing her something impossible. She shook her head. The waterfall, she said, was in an area that had been completely restricted in 1986. No trails, no legal access. And she'd never been back to Mount Rainier after they left. Couldn't bring herself to return, couldn't face the place that had destroyed her family. Until she was 18 and desperately needed to know if the dreams meant something real. As she got older, the dreams evolved again. They became less frequent but more intense. Instead of seeing Cassidy's daily life, she'd see moments of significance. She dreamed about Cassidy giving birth, alone in the cave except for the creature attending her, helping her through labor the way a midwife might. She woke from that dream knowing with absolute certainty that somewhere in the mountains, her twin sister had become a mother. She dreamed about celebrations, gatherings where multiple creatures would come together in a clearing under the full moon, making sounds that seemed almost like singing. And Cassidy would be there, dancing among them, her movements wild and free in a way Sienna remembered from their childhood, from before everything changed. She dreamed about deaths too. She watched the original creature, the one who had taken Cassidy, grow old in the dreams. Watched it slow down, watched its dark fur turn gray, watched the day it lay down in the back of the cave and didn't get up again. In the dream, Cassidy had wept over its body. This thing that had stolen her from her family but had also raised her, protected her, taught her everything about survival in a world humans had forgotten how to navigate. The therapists Sienna saw as an adult had various interpretations. Some thought the dreams represented her processing the loss, creating an elaborate fantasy where her sister was alive and thriving as a way to avoid accepting death. Others thought it was a form of dissociation, a split in her psyche where part of her continued to live the life Cassidy never got to have. A few suggested she might be experiencing something called pseudo-memories, false recollections so vivid they seemed real, generated by a traumatized brain trying to fill in gaps in a narrative that had no satisfying conclusion. But none of them could explain the predictive elements, the waterfall that existed, the landslide that happened, the specific details about animal behavior and forest ecology that Sienna had no training in, but that turned out to be accurate when verified by experts. 3 years ago, Sienna told me, the dreams changed again, and this time they brought a message. She dreamed that Cassidy came to her, not in the forest, not in the cave, but in the tent where they'd slept as 7-year-olds. They were both adults now in the dream, but they were back in that pink-walled tent, sitting cross-legged facing each other the way they used to when they were little and telling secrets. Cassidy looked weathered, her skin tanned and marked with scars, her hair wild and streaked with gray, despite being only in her early 40s, but her eyes were clear and calm. She reached out and took Sienna's hands, and in the dream, Sienna could feel the calluses on her sister's palms, could feel the strength in her grip. Cassidy told her it was time for Sienna to stop carrying the guilt, the question, the weight of not knowing. She told her that what had happened wasn't Sienna's fault, that the creature had chosen Cassidy specifically for reasons that had nothing to do with which twin was braver or which one had unzipped the tent. She said the creatures were dying. Their numbers had dwindled over the decades, hunted and displaced and poisoned by human expansion into their territories. They needed new blood, new genetics, new possibilities for survival. That night in 1986, the creature had come to the campground looking for a child. Not to harm, not to kill, but to raise, to integrate into their failing population. It had sensed Cassidy's boldness, her curiosity, her willingness to step toward the unknown rather than away from it. And it had taken her not as a victim, but as a possibility, as hope for a species on the brink of extinction. In the dream, Cassidy said she'd had a good life. Different from the one she would have had, certainly, but good in its own way. She'd learned things no human had known in millennia, lived in harmony with a world most people never even saw. She'd had children, raised them between two worlds, taught them about the human family they'd never meet, but that flowed through their DNA. And then Cassidy said the thing that had finally driven Sienna to contact me after all these years. She said that the time was coming when the choice would be offered again, that the creatures were desperate now, their population down to numbers that made extinction inevitable without intervention. And they were going to reach out one more time, to one more human family, to offer one more child the chance to bridge the gap between species. Cassidy told Sienna that when it happened, when the news broke of another child disappearing in the mountains under mysterious circumstances, Sienna needed to speak up, needed to tell the truth, the whole truth, regardless of how insane it sounded, because the alternative was watching another family destroyed by grief and guilt and unanswered questions. The alternative was silence, allowing fear to drive policy, to justify hunting down the few remaining creatures, to finish the extinction that was already underway. Sienna woke from that dream and knew with a certainty she couldn't explain or defend that it wasn't just a dream, that it was real communication somehow, that her sister was alive, and that everything Sienna had seen over the decades of dreaming had been real glimpses into a life that defied everything we thought we knew about what was possible. She looked at me across the coffee shop table, her untouched drink now cold, and asked me what she should do, because she'd been watching the news religiously for 3 years since that dream, waiting for the story that would match what Cassidy had told her, waiting for another disappearance that bore the hallmarks of what had happened to her and her sister in 1986. And 2 weeks ago, she'd seen it. A family camping in the North Cascades. A tent opened in the night. A 6-year-old boy vanished without a trace. Massive footprints found near the campsite, dismissed by authorities as bear tracks. Search teams finding nothing despite days of intensive searching. And a sibling left behind. A 4-year-old sister who kept telling anyone who would listen that a big, furry giant had come and taken her brother to live in the mountain. The story was being covered as a tragic disappearance, possible abduction by a transient, ongoing investigation. But Sienna recognized the pattern. She knew what had really happened, and she was terrified because speaking up would mean exposing herself to ridicule and disbelief, would mean reopening wounds she'd spent decades trying to heal, would mean potentially destroying the credibility she'd built in her professional life. But staying silent meant that family would live with the same questions, the same guilt, the same incompleteness that had haunted the Whitmores for 38 years. It meant the little girl who'd witnessed her brother's disappearance would spend her life the way Sienna had, carrying a truth no one would believe, doubting her own memories, wondering if she was crazy. So Sienna had made a decision. She was going to go public with her story, all of it. The dreams, the correlations, the message from Cassidy, everything. She knew what it would cost her, but she also knew it was the right thing to do, the only thing to do, and she wanted me to help her because I was there, because I'd been the first person to hear her testimony as a child, to document what she'd seen, to treat her with compassion rather than dismissal. She thought if we went public together, if a respected psychologist and trauma specialist corroborated her account, if we presented the evidence we'd both accumulated over the years, maybe people would listen. Maybe it would make a difference. I sat there in that coffee shop, looking at this woman who'd lived her entire life under the shadow of an impossible truth, and I made my own choice. I told her yes, I'd help her. I'd stand with her and share what I knew, what I'd researched, what I'd suspected but been too afraid to voice. We started preparing. Sienna wrote out her complete testimony, every dream, every detail, every correlation she'd discovered. I compiled my research, the database of disappearances, the patterns I'd identified, the cases that matched the profile of what had happened to Cassidy. We consulted with other experts carefully, people who had expertise in cryptozoology, in indigenous oral histories, in wilderness ecology, and we discovered we weren't as alone as we'd thought. There were others who'd had similar experiences. A man in Oregon whose son had disappeared in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest 15 years ago, who'd reported seeing something massive and bipedal in the trees, but had been dismissed as a grief-stricken parent looking for any explanation. A woman in British Columbia whose sister had vanished during a hiking trip in the 80s, who'd been found 3 days later, alive and unhurt, but who'd told a story about friendly giants that no one believed. Some of these witnesses had spent years being silenced, having their testimonies buried in official reports, being labeled as unreliable or mentally unstable. But their stories had a consistency that was striking. Children taken or contacted by large hair-covered beings, returned alive and unharmed or not returned at all. Witnesses describing behavior that wasn't aggressive or predatory, but purposeful, selective, almost ritualistic. We found reports from indigenous communities that told similar stories going back generations. Accounts of children who'd been taken into the forest by the ancient ones and who came back years later, if they came back at all, changed. Speaking of living among a hidden people, of learning their ways, of being part of something older than human civilization. The stories had been dismissed as folklore, as cultural mythology, as primitive superstition. But what if they weren't? What if these accounts represented a real phenomenon that had been happening for centuries, a desperate survival strategy by a species on the edge of extinction, bringing in human genetics to save themselves? It was a theory that sounded insane, but it fit the evidence in a way nothing else did. We scheduled a press conference for October 15th. Sienna would present her testimony. I would provide the supporting research. We'd open it up for questions, knowing full well we'd be torn apart by skeptics, but hoping that somewhere in the audience would be people who needed to hear this. The family with the missing 6-year-old, other families with unanswered questions, anyone who'd ever glimpsed something in the forest that they couldn't explain but couldn't forget. The night before the press conference, I had a dream. The first real dream I'd had about the case in all the years since it happened. I was back at Mount Rainier, standing in the clearing where we'd found Sienna, but it wasn't empty this time. Cassidy was there. She looked exactly as Sienna had described from her dreams. Weather-worn, strong, her eyes holding a wildness and peace that seemed contradictory but somehow fit perfectly. She was standing next to one of the creatures, a massive being covered in dark hair, shot through with silver, its posture protective but not threatening. Cassidy smiled at me, and in the dream, I understood something I'd been too afraid to fully accept while awake. This wasn't a tragedy, this was a choice, a different kind of life, but a life nonetheless. And she was asking me to help other people understand that, to help them see beyond the fear and the loss, to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there were other ways to exist in this world than the narrow paths we'd built for ourselves. I woke up with tears on my face and a certainty in my chest. Whatever happened at that press conference, whatever ridicule or professional destruction came my way, I was doing the right thing. The conference room was packed. News outlets had picked up on the teaser we'd released, curious about the dramatic claims a psychologist and a survivor were making about a decades-old case. Sienna sat beside me at the table, her jaw set, her hands folded tightly in front of her. I could see her trembling slightly, but her voice was steady when she began to speak. She told them everything: the taking of her sister, the decades of dreams, the correlations with reality, the message from Cassidy, the new disappearance in the North Cascades that matched the pattern. She spoke for 40 minutes without notes, her testimony clear and detailed and absolutely impossible. Then I presented my research. The database of disappearances, the patterns that suggested something beyond random chance, the indigenous accounts, the physical evidence that had been dismissed or ignored. I showed photographs of the footprint casts that had been made at the Whitmore campsite, the ones that had been filed away and forgotten but that I'd tracked down in storage. Casts of prints that were clearly not human, not bear, but something else entirely. The room erupted into chaos when we opened for questions, reporters shouting, some with genuine curiosity, others with barely concealed contempt. How could we expect anyone to believe this? What evidence did we have beyond anecdotal accounts and dreams? Weren't we exploiting a tragedy for attention? But then something unexpected happened. A woman stood up in the back of the room. She identified herself as Sarah Chen, the mother of the 6-year-old who disappeared in the North Cascades 2 weeks earlier. Her voice shook as she spoke, but her words were clear. She said her daughter Emma had been telling the same story Sienna had told 38 years earlier, a big, gentle creature that smelled like earth. Her brother going willingly, not struggling, not screaming in terror but in surprise. Emma insisted her brother was safe, that the creature would take care of him, that he'd gone to live in the secret place in the mountains. Everyone had told Sarah her daughter was traumatized, confused, creating a fantasy to cope with the loss of her brother. But listening to Sienna's testimony, hearing the exact same details from a case decades earlier, Sarah said she finally understood. Her daughter was telling the truth. And if there was any chance, any possibility that what Sienna described was real, Sarah needed to know, needed to understand. She asked us, with tears streaming down her face, if we thought her son was alive, if we thought he was somewhere in the mountains, being raised by creatures that science said didn't exist, but that apparently had been taking human children for purposes we could barely comprehend. Sienna looked at this woman, this mother drowning in the same ocean of uncertainty and grief that had swallowed her own parents, and she said yes. She believed it was possible, more than possible. She believed with everything in her that somewhere in those mountains, that woman's son was alive and adapting to a life none of us could imagine. The press conference ended in more chaos, but the story had been told. It spread across the internet, dividing people into camps of believers and skeptics, spawning countless debates and investigations and think pieces. Sienna and I were both professionally destroyed, as we'd known we would be. I was asked to resign from my university position. Sienna lost clients who didn't want to be associated with someone who'd gone public with such an outlandish claim. But we also received hundreds of messages from people who'd had similar experiences, people who'd seen things in the forests they couldn't explain, families of missing persons who recognized patterns in our data, indigenous community members who said their elders had been telling these stories for generations and thanking us for finally giving voice to truths that had been suppressed. And 3 months after the press conference, something remarkable happened. Emma Chen, the 4-year-old sister of the missing boy, started having dreams. Dreams where she saw her brother living in a cave with large, gentle creatures. Dreams that matched, detail for detail, the ones Sienna had been having for 38 years. Sarah Chen contacted us immediately. The 3 of us formed a support group of sorts, a small circle of people who understood what it meant to live with an impossible truth. Sarah documented Emma's dreams the way Sienna had documented her own. And when Emma described a specific location, a distinctive rock formation near an alpine lake, we organized an expedition. We hiked into the backcountry with a small team, following Emma's description, and we found the place, exactly as a 4-year-old with no wilderness experience had described it. We searched the area carefully, and Sienna found something tucked into a crevice in the rocks, a small bundle wrapped in bark. Inside was a child's jacket, the one Sarah Chen's son had been wearing the night he disappeared. It had been cleaned, mended, carefully preserved, and tucked into the pocket was a smooth river stone, the kind a child might collect, with a simple spiral carved into its surface. A message, perhaps, a sign that he was there, that he was all right, that he was leaving evidence for those who knew how to look. We didn't publicize this finding, didn't report it to authorities who would launch a search that would likely drive the creatures deeper into hiding. Instead, we left our own message, a small leather pouch containing photographs of Sarah and Emma, some of the boys' favorite snacks still in their wrappers, and a letter from Sarah telling her son she loved him. She didn't understand, but she accepted, and that he should live whatever life was meant for him. 3 months later, Emma dreamed about her brother finding the pouch, opening it, looking at the photographs with tears in his eyes, but also with a smile. He wasn't coming back, Emma told her mother after that dream, but he wanted them to know he was happy. He was where he was supposed to be. It's been 2 years since the press conference. The story has faded from mainstream attention, remembered mostly as a bizarre footnote, a case of mass delusion or clever hoax, depending on who you ask. But for those of us who know the truth, life has changed in profound ways. Sienna still has the dreams, though less frequently now. She sees Cassidy as a grandmother, teaching young ones about both the forest ways and the human world they'll never fully be part of, but that flows through their veins. She sees celebrations and gatherings, sees a small community fighting to survive against impossible odds, but not giving up, not fading quietly into extinction. Sarah Chen has found a strange peace with her son's disappearance. It's not the resolution she would have chosen, not the life she imagined for him, but it's something other than death, something other than the horror of not knowing. Emma continues to dream, continues to provide glimpses into her brother's life, and Sarah documents it all, creating a record of a life lived in the spaces between our world and theirs. As for me, I've accepted that my career as it was is over, but I've found a new purpose. I work with families of missing persons in wilderness areas, helping them navigate their grief while also gently asking about the details of their cases, looking for patterns, looking for signs that maybe their loved one's disappearance fits the profile we've identified. I've found 17 cases in the past 2 years that match. 17 families who might be living with an impossible truth, not knowing there are others like them, not knowing there might be an explanation beyond the unbearable randomness of loss. I'm writing a book about all of this, not for publication, not to convince skeptics or win over critics, but as a record, a documentation of something that's happening in the remote places of our world, something that science won't acknowledge and society won't accept, but that continues nonetheless. Because I believe now what I couldn't let myself believe 38 years ago. The creatures are real. They're intelligent, purposeful, and desperate. They're dying out, their world shrinking as ours expands, and they're making impossible choices to survive. Taking human children, raising them in a world we've forgotten, hoping that hybrid bloodlines will give their species a future. It's not kidnapping as we understand it. It's not violence or predation. It's selection. It's adaptation. It's a dying species reaching out across the boundaries we've drawn between civilization and wilderness, between human and other, asking for help in the only way they know how. Cassidy Whitmore, wherever she is in those mountains, made a choice that night. Or maybe the choice was made for her, but she accepted it, adapted to it, built a life within it. She's alive in ways that matter beyond the simple biological fact of breathing. She's a bridge between worlds, a possibility, a hope for something we're still too afraid to fully comprehend. And somewhere in the North Cascades, Sarah Chen's son is learning the same lessons, walking the same impossible path, becoming part of a story that's been unfolding for longer than human civilization can remember. I'm 63 years old now. I've spent 38 years carrying the weight of what happened to Cassidy Whitmore, and I'll carry it until I die. But it's a different kind of weight now. Not guilt or failure, but responsibility. The responsibility of knowing something true that most people will never believe, and choosing to speak that truth anyway, because the silence serves no one. Not the families torn apart by disappearances they can't understand. Not the creatures fighting for survival in the shrinking wild places. Not the children who cross between worlds and deserve to have their existence acknowledged even if it can't be explained. Sienna was right to break her silence. Sarah Chen was right to believe her daughter, and I was right to stand with them. Professional consequences be damned, because some truths are more important than credibility. The forests are still full of mysteries, still hold secrets we've forgotten how to see. And in those deepest, wildest places where human footprints rarely fall, there are lives being lived that we can barely imagine. Children learning to speak in sounds that aren't quite language, to move through the forest like shadows, to bridge two worlds that were never meant to meet, but that have been meeting generation after generation in acts of desperation and hope that we're only now beginning to understand. Cassidy Whitmore disappeared on June 14th, 1986. But she didn't die. She transformed. She became something we don't have words for, something between the world she was born into and the world that claimed her. And through her sister's dreams, through Emma Chen's visions, through the testimonies of others who've glimpsed these impossible truths, her story continues. This is what I know. This is what I believe. This is the truth I'm choosing to tell before it's too late, before the last of the creatures disappear and take their secrets with them, before the bridges between our worlds collapse entirely. Twin girls went missing in 1986. Only one returned. What she said about Bigfoot was disturbing because it was true, and that truth is still unfolding in the mountains. in the dreams of those connected to it, in the lives being lived beyond the edge of everything we think we understand about what's possible. I don't expect you to believe me. I don't expect this testimony to change minds or shift paradigms. But I needed to tell it. For Cassidy and Sienna Whitmore, for Sarah and Emma Chen, and the boy who followed the creature into the mountains, for all the families still searching, still wondering, still living with questions that have no acceptable answers. The forests remember what we've forgotten, and in their deepest hearts, where humans rarely go, there are still wonders and terrors and possibilities that defy everything we think we know. I've spent my life trying to understand them, and I've learned that understanding isn't the point. Acceptance is. Bearing witness is. Telling the truth, no matter how impossible, is what matters. This is my truth. Take it or leave it, believe it or dismiss it. But know that somewhere in the mountains, right now, children are learning to live between worlds, and their stories deserve to be told.